In March 2025, something happened that almost nobody covered. Canada's exports to non-American countries jumped 24.8%. That is the second largest single-month surge in Canadian recorded history. At the exact same moment, Canadian exports to America dropped 6.6%. That was the biggest American drop since the pandemic lockdowns of 2020. $300 billion in annual trade is now moving away from American ports, and the number Washington is most afraid of is $600 billion by 2035. Hit subscribe on Market Mindset because what comes next gets significantly more serious very fast. Let us go back to February 1st, 2025. That morning, Donald Trump signed an executive order targeting Canadian goods directly. 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports entered American law. Ottawa had 48 hours to respond before markets opened Monday morning globally. Canada's response was immediate and far larger than Washington expected. Retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods came first. Within 3 weeks, that escalated to $155 billion total. But here is what the tariff headlines completely missed. While politicians shouted about tariffs, Canadian trade ministers made phone calls quietly. Not to Washington, to Brussels, to Tokyo, to New Delhi, to Beijing. Canada was not just retaliating. Canada was fundamentally restructuring its entire economic architecture permanently. For decades, Canada sent approximately 75% of all exports directly to America. 97% of Canadian oil production crossed the border southward every single day. This was structural economic vulnerability at scale. One American policy decision away from a severe economic crisis always. Trump's tariffs proved that vulnerability was completely real and dangerous. When 50% tariffs threatened Canadian dairy, lumber, steel, and electronics simultaneously, the shock ran through every Canadian province. But pain produced clarity, and clarity produced the most aggressive Canadian pivot in decades. Mark Carney's government launched what officials internally called an economic insurance strategy. The goal was simple, but historically ambitious. Never be this vulnerable again to Washington. Canada published its State of Trade 2026 report confirming export growth to Asia, Europe, and emerging markets was accelerating significantly. The growth was nearly 3 times larger than the decline toward America. Canada was not just replacing American trade volume. Canada was growing beyond it entirely. Japan was buying Canadian critical minerals. Germany was signing clean energy agreements. India was expanding economic partnership discussions. Ecuador signed a full bilateral free trade agreement with Canada on July 24, 2026. That was the first Latin American free trade agreement Canada signed in years. It was a direct signal to Washington about where Canadian attention was moving. Canada signed over 20 critical mineral deals across 12 countries. Total investment commitments reached approximately 18 billion Canadian dollars. Japan's Panasonic Energy signed a memorandum for lithium offtake with Frontier Lithium. That deal connects Canadian lithium directly into Japanese electric vehicle battery supply chains permanently. Defense Metals Corporation participated in a 17-company rare earth trade mission to Europe, visiting Rome, Munich, and Paris with formal government backing. Being on Europe's strategic partner list means Canadian minerals are now embedded in European industrial policy permanently. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion completed in 2024 carries 890,000 barrels per day westward to the British Columbia coast. In 2024, this capacity sat partially unused because American refineries were still the default customer. By mid-2026, Asian buyers were actively competing for tanker slots regularly. South Korean refineries, Japanese energy companies, Indian state oil corporations, all buying Canadian crude directly. Canadian energy producers realized they had genuine pricing power they had never exercised before in history. The India opportunity presents perhaps the most underreported dimension of Canada's trade diversification story. The Canada-India Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement had been stalled for years due to diplomatic tensions. By 2026, both governments were cautiously re-engaging on economic tracks. India's middle class of approximately 400 million consumers represents an extraordinary export opportunity. Canadian agricultural products, particularly lentils, peas, and wheat, have natural demand. Ottawa trade officials described India as the single largest untapped bilateral trade opportunity Canada currently possesses. Canada's trade diversification strategy identified China, India, and other Asian markets as primary growth destinations. It also emphasized the European market through the existing Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. CEDA covers 500 million European consumers. Before the trade war, Canadian businesses treated CEDA as secondary. After February 2025, CEDA became Canada's primary economic highway. Brussels and Ottawa accelerated implementation of provisions. Tariff eliminations on Canadian agricultural products moved faster than any previous timeline. Overall, what America's tariffs accidentally created was a permanent European appetite for Canadian agricultural products. The auto sector tells an equally significant story about how deep this restructuring goes. Ontario's auto corridor suddenly faced an existential supply chain question. Do Canadian suppliers continue betting everything on American market access or diversify immediately? Stellantis, Honda, and Toyota all operate significant Canadian facilities with global export capability. Those companies began quietly modeling European and Asian export scenarios they had never seriously considered before. Canadian companies were physically moving inventory, renegotiating contracts, and opening new shipping routes rapidly. Port Metro Vancouver reported significant increases in Asia-Pacific container volume throughout 2026. Canadian freight forwarders described the period as the busiest logistics reconfiguration in their careers. Trucks that used to cross into Michigan now load containers headed to Rotterdam instead. Here is what makes Canada's position uniquely powerful. America needed Canadian inputs more urgently than most American politicians publicly acknowledged. Canadian potash feeds approximately 85% of American agricultural fertilizer requirements every growing season. Canadian uranium fuels approximately 25% of American nuclear power generation capacity. American refineries on the Gulf Coast are physically configured to process heavy Canadian crude. Reconfiguring those refineries would cost billions and take years. Canadian softwood lumber supplies approximately 30% of American housing construction material requirements annually. The hydropower dimension adds another layer that receives almost no attention. Canadian hydroelectric generation supplies significant electricity volumes to American northeastern states. New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut all receive meaningful percentages of their electricity from Canadian sources. America had spent decades building infrastructure that assumed Canadian cooperation as a permanent background condition. Threatening Canada with tariffs while depending on Canadian electricity was a profound strategic miscalculation from Washington. The CUSMA renegotiation process that began in July 2026 reflected all of these realities directly. But here is what the American position failed to account for completely. Canada entered those renegotiations with genuine alternatives that did not exist in previous trade negotiations. In every previous negotiation, Canada's alternative to an American deal was essentially no deal at all. By July 2026, Canada's alternative was a $600 billion non-American trade network under active construction. That changed the fundamental negotiating mathematics in ways the American side had not fully internalized yet. When your counterpart has a credible outside option, your leverage diminishes regardless of your absolute economic size. The G7 summit in Evian, France in June 2026 crystallized Canada's new international positioning unmistakably. Canada participated not as America's quiet neighbor, but as an independent voice with its own relationships established. Carney had already met Xi Jinping in Beijing in January 2026 and secured a preliminary bilateral agreement. The Beijing meeting gave Canada diplomatic credibility with China that no other G7 member currently possessed. Reuters reported in March 2026, a development that Wall Street largely ignored completely. Japan, France, and Canada were building an alternative to the American-led critical minerals bloc. 3 senior G7 officials confirmed the Alternative Buyers Club concept was under active development. Canada was not merely joining this initiative. Canada was leading it. Japanese trading houses were signing direct agreements with Canadian mining companies without American intermediaries involved. French industrial conglomerates were negotiating processing agreements for Canadian rare earth materials. The financial flows connected to these agreements were measured in billions and denominated in euros and yen, not American dollars. The story of Canada's 24.8% export surge is ultimately a story about irreversibility. Trade relationships once established do not simply dissolve when political conditions change. Japanese manufacturers who integrated Canadian lithium into their supply chains will not switch back to uncertainty willingly. European food processors who discovered Canadian agricultural quality will continue buying regardless of what Washington eventually decides. South Korean refineries configured to process Canadian crude will maintain those relationships for operational efficiency reasons permanently. Every day that Canadian trade flows through Rotterdam, Tokyo, and Seoul, rather than through American ports, the infrastructure of continental dependency that America spent decades building becomes slightly less essential to Canadian prosperity, and slightly less essential compounds over time into something that no future administration can easily reverse. Canada did not just redirect some trade flows in one difficult month. Canada restructured the foundational architecture of its entire economic future in response to one American policy mistake. The $600 billion target is not ambition. It is the mathematical conclusion of an irreversible process. The most significant economic relationship in North American history will never look exactly the same again.